Hi, everyone. So welcome to the National Conservation Training Center in collaboration with the National Climate Adaptation Science Center webinar. What we'll be doing is we'll be learning more about the RAD framework, a decision-making tool that helps resource managers make informed strategies for responding to ecological changes resulting from climate change. And so without further ado, I will have Sean Carter introduce our speakers.
Great, thank you, Phil. It's my privilege to introduce two of my esteemed colleagues at the National Climate Adaptation Science Center in West Virginia. So Dr. Abby Lynch and Dr. Laura Thompson have both been with the program for some years now, and they both specialize generally on climate impacts to fish, wildlife, and ecosystems for DOI, Trust Resources. Abby is a research fisheries ecologist specializing in inland fish, both locally in certain parts of the US, but also globally on international fora. And Laura is a wildlife research ecologist in my program, likewise focusing on climate impacts to fish and wildlife species, terrestrial species. So today they're going to be talking about a framework that we've been working on with partners and others to try to move the needle forward on climate adaptation and responses to climate impacts for fish and wildlife. So I'll turn it over to Abby and Laura.
Great, thanks, Sean. And we'll go ahead and get started here. As Phil and Sean have mentioned, what we're going to be talking about today is the RAD, or Resist, Accept, Direct Climate Change Adaptation Framework. And just as a bit of a refresher, I think a lot of folks are familiar with the program that both Laura and I are a part of, we're the host for this webinar series, but I think it's always worth a small reminder on what the Climate Adaptation Science Centers do. So the main focus of our program, or the mission of our program, is to deliver science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. And the focus of our program is really on impacts and adaptations. So our program looks to help managers protect our public lands and natural resources. We collaborate with tribes and indigenous communities to prepare for climate risks. And we also educate and train the next generation of scientists. So this is the general focus of the Climate Adaptation Science Centers. There are, as many folks are aware, 9 regional climate adaptation science centers in the National Center. These are federal and university partnerships with a federal director and a university lead, and often these are consortium based. And both Laura and I, though not necessarily located in the same place in the country, we are both housed in the National Climate Adaptation Science Center. So today, back to this beach picture. Over the course of this short presentation, we hope to convey a few basic points. First, the main premise is that we'll start from the premise that ecosystems are changing in an unprecedented way. If we continue to use the same approaches, then we are likely to be unsuccessful in designing effective management strategies to meet these new challenges. Second, that the RAD, or Resist, Accept, Direct framework is a useful tool for navigating this unfamiliar territory of systems change. And third, we'll try to end by making this all practicable. And though this may be a new way of looking at these issues, the suite of approaches available for addressing these issues are really not often so radical. And there are a lot of existing tools at our disposal. So starting with the premise that ecosystems are changing, I wanted to first provide a short kind of personal example to set the stage. So this photo is a photo that I took of my family at Hunting Island State Park, and this is near Beaufort, South Carolina. And for those of you not familiar with this area, it's about a little less than a 2-hour drive from Charleston, and it's the most popular state park in South Carolina. There's somewhere in the range of 1.1 million visitors a year to this park. And so even though I personally mostly work on inland fish and fisheries, when I think of systems change, the image of Hunting Island often comes to mind. And I think that's like for me, as it is for many others, I think climate change is often very intangible, and it operates on very long timescales. But there are a few systems, such as these coastal systems, that are experiencing sea level rise, where these long-term impacts of slow processes are still very clearly recognizable, even on human timescales of understanding. And so, in addition to these kind of slow processes, then there are fast events like hurricanes that can drastically alter these landscapes just overnight. And these fast events are becoming increasingly frequent because of this ongoing slower process related to sea level rise. So I just wanted to provide this as kind of a short personal timeline of myself on Hunting Island, just to set the stage for the broader RAD framework. So to begin with, and I use this dog photo based on the sage advice of my graduate mentor, Bill Taylor, who was from Michigan State, who always said that you have to have a dog photo in any talk. But anyways, this is a photo of my dog Ben, and this is on Hunting Island in 2014. And actually, this was my wedding day. My husband and I got married in Beaufort, and he took Ben to the beach just before the wedding. But really, the point of sharing this photo is to draw your attention to the landscape behind the dog. And you can see that Hunting Island was very forested in 2014. So there were pines, palmetto palms, and even live oaks that were right up to the beach. And so when you would drive out to this park, you would drive through what I kind of envisioned as like a prehistoric jungle. And in fact, if you want a kind of another image of this place, Hunting Island was actually a stand-in for all of the Vietnam scenes in Forrest Gump. And actually another kind of movie trivia fact is that most of the whole movie of Forrest Gump was filmed in and around Beaufort, even though it was supposed to take place all around the world. So if you imagine kind of that jungle feel, that is really what Hunting Island looked like in 2014. But in 2016, Hurricane Matthew hit Hunting Island. It hit Beaufort and it hit Charleston pretty dead on. And so this came with a lot of debris, and a lot of very large, big, old live oaks came down in the storm. And so the cleanup efforts were really massive, and they took a long time. So the state park at Hunting Island was closed for a very long time to remove all the downed trees and the debris from all the recreational areas. So the next time, so the park reopened in stages, and the next time I was able to get back down there was in the summer of 2017. And this is when my son Miles was just a baby. But again, the point of this photo is to draw your attention to the canopy again. And you can see that by this point, so from 2014 to 2017 here, the canopy is much thinner. The infrastructure was also very limited in the park, and everything was kind of very scaled back, even though they were allowing people to visit. And then just as the park was about to fully reopen, about a year after that storm, Matthew hit, they were hit by another storm. This was Irma in 2017. And this storm wasn't nearly the strength that Matthew was for South Carolina, but the high water levels were actually higher in the storm, enough to generate a 15 to 20 foot storm surge on Hunting Island, which again flooded out a lot of the electrical system. And ordinarily this part of the coastline on the eastern seaboard is pretty protected from storms, just because based on the coastal shape, they're not in a particularly vulnerable spot, like for example the Outer Banks. So the fact that they were hit by two storms of this magnitude back to back was pretty substantial for this area. So by the time my family got back to Hunting Island again, it was in winter in 2018. And the park had fully reopened, but there was still a whole bunch of downed trees, like the one that my family's standing on here. And many of the roads were still completely impassable. But then by August 2020, things had changed. And so at this point, perhaps most substantially, there was a massive beach nourishment program. So they built up dunes, they had beach grass plantings, and the beach looked substantially different than it did back in that kind of original photo that I showed from 2014. So in that amount of time, so 6 years, it was a very different place. So most of the trees that were still alive were just the palms, and everything else was, as you can see, is already kind of losing, was already kind of moving to decay. So it lost a bunch of that kind of prehistoric jungle feel in an attempt to armor against climate change. And then this final photo was actually just this past winter. And it's my sons and my nephew are playing on a beach green. And so now there's really a really wide, substantial beach. And some of the beach grass is starting to fill in. There is still some infrastructure in disrepair, and most of the forested part of the island is really experiencing dramatic change. So many of the trees are slowly dying from kind of continued inundation of salt water. And while there have always been ghost forests on Hunting Island, since I started visiting there, they're very rapidly and visibly expanding at this point. And just a quick plug for a really great piece of climate change communication that's showing the impacts of sea level rise on Hunting Island. This is featuring a friend of mine, Laura Clark, who works for Pew. And it came out, I think it was in last November, so on NPR, and it's got some really great imagery of those ghost forests, and there's some good conversations with Laura and some local St. Helena's Island fishermen, and as well as the chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation, which is very locally based on St. Helena's Island as well. So, even in this relatively short span of time, we've been able to see dramatic change occurring across this landscape. And we've also seen management interventions that have been put in place to address this transforming system. And so I just present this little vignette to tee up the remainder of the talk. This is an example from me, but it's like an example of ecosystem transformations that are happening across this landscape as they are across diverse landscapes. So thinking ahead, there are other landscapes where things are happening at the same speed or even faster in some cases. So in the Arctic, sea ice is retreating to the point where walruses are having to go higher up on beaches where there's an increased risk of stampede mortalities, for example. The altitudinal limit of savannas is increasing and spreading into grasslands, as shown here in this example from South Africa. In tropical oceans, rising ocean temperature and ocean acidification are causing mass coral bleaching events. Or here at the base of the Cedar Mountains in the Great Basin, there's been recent grassification of habitat that's incurred with fire-induced invasion of cheatgrass. And lastly, and perhaps maybe among the most visually stark examples, we have glacier retreat and mountain snowpack that's being lost, and as shown here in Glacier National Park, which leads to the kind of, it has led in some cases, such as here in Glacier National Park, to Endangered Species Act listings for aquatic species like the meltwater stonefly, which rely on that glacial melt for portions of their life cycle. So as an ecological concept, ecosystem change is really nothing new, but the current causes are really unprecedented. So historically, the main driver of systems change was natural climate variability following glacial and interglacial timescales. But now we know that most global change is anthropogenically derived. So we have climate change, land use change, invasive species, disease, habitat fragmentation. This list can go on and on. And these transformations are occurring at unprecedented rates and across unprecedented scales. But in the near term, at least, if these extreme transformations aren't happening in your particular system, it can be easier to not think about those longer term changes and what they might be. But delayed action can really increase the risk of irreversible change in ecosystem structure, function, and composition, and it can result in lost opportunities to adapt to ecosystem changes. And this paralysis really equates to higher cumulative economic costs, greater losses of ecosystem services, and more substantial consequences to natural system. But we often lack a common language for having these uncomfortable conversations about what comes next, when we can no longer maintain ecosystems or restore or rehabilitate ecosystems to what they once were, and really have to start thinking about when to consider other options. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Laura.
So thank you, Abby. So in response to unprecedented changes, we would like to present the Resist, Accept, Direct, or RAD framework, which allows managers, it provides managers with a way to take next steps to some of these drastically changing ecosystems. So in addition to having a catchy name, the RAD framework is super useful just because it provides the entire decision space that encompasses all the potential options that a manager might consider for responding to ecosystem transformation. So this allows a manager to think about different trade-offs associated with each option and potential and how it could affect different ecosystems accordingly. So stepping through each of these options, moving to the Resist ecosystem transformation choice, a manager, this is something a manager will probably be most familiar with. It's a way to resist changes in ecosystem structure and function by promoting a system that is similar to what it was in the past or historically. So an example of a resist action would be eradicating invasive species that have potentially moved farther north because of ideal environmental conditions, or restoring floodplains, particularly along certain rivers where flooding is increased due to climate change. The next option is accept. And so accepting ecosystem transformation is when you yield to certain changes that may occur, maybe because a manager is not able to effectively respond to certain changes, or in some cases, the changes might be acceptable or even desirable, desirable outcome. So, for example, in northern Minnesota, moose are declining pretty drastically in certain portions of the state because of shorter winters. And so this increases winter ticks and as well as other diseases. But managers are largely accepting these losses, and in their place, white-tailed deer are moving farther north because of these milder winters. And because of this, managers or stakeholders still have hunting opportunities in the region. So these changes are largely being accepted. Directing change is when you would steward an ecosystem to some other ecosystem state. And this is probably an option that is least familiar to natural resource managers and is often the one, but not always, that you might get pushback from stakeholders just because it may involve some outside the box thinking off the time, oftentimes, but may also require a lot of buy-in from stakeholders to be able to carry something out. So an example of a direct option is, for example, if a tree species is no longer able to persist in certain environments, a manager might consider bringing in new species and creating tree plots that can persist better in those conditions. For example, being able to survive insect outbreaks or resist insect outbreaks. And so the RAD framework has, as I mentioned, it's kind of an all-encompassing framework. So the advantages is that you have all these three choices, but they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. For example, in northern Minnesota, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources are protecting Cisco and certain lakes. They're investing their resources where where they're able to keep lakes cooler for these forage fish that provide food for like walleye species, and then other lakes where there's agricultural areas and lots of human activity, they can no longer maintain those cooler refugia for the Cisco population. So they're largely accepting changes to this region. So you might wonder when you would consider using resist, accept, and direct. And a lot of factors can play into this. And Abby will get more into this later in the talk, but considerations of scale is certainly very important. Spatial scale in particular, at smaller spatial scales, you can have more intensive management efforts and work with limited budgets. But a disadvantage of that is you may have spillover effects from surrounding regions that are managed differently. At larger scales, you may be able to operate at the full distribution of a particular ecosystem or species. But these actions, these large scale actions are likely to be more costly, and you have to involve more jurisdictional boundaries and a much larger number of stakeholders. Considerations of time scale is also important. So decision timelines and the speed of ecosystem change, as well as the speed of social change, can operate at different speeds. So for example, decision timeline may be shorter than in cases where ecosystems are transforming slowly. And so a resist option might be reasonable in some of those cases until you know more about how the ecosystem is changing. In other cases, you may have very rapid ecosystem change, and which requires drastic management action, but the speed of social change and accepting the idea of a new ecosystem in a certain region can be challenging. So these are all factors that might play into whether you would choose a resist, accept, or direct actions. And then finally, considerations of magnitude. So you have, or this is sometimes we call it comprehensiveness of change. And so this kind of explain this. If you think about change or loss of a certain species, just a single species versus maybe an indicator species or a keystone species, and then compared with multiple species within a guild or multiple functional groups to disappearance of an entire ecosystem, some strategies may be more reasonable or less reasonable depending on this comprehensiveness or magnitude of change. So in theory, the RAD framework seems pretty intuitive. But the question is, a lot of managers ask, how would we operationalize the RAD framework? For example, what strategy should we choose and when should we choose it? If you wait too long to act, and then resisting change may be essentially futile. And so, but at the same time, waiting that long, you also potentially lose opportunities, as Abby mentioned, and this can increase consequences to natural systems and potential loss of ecosystem structure and associated services. So I'm going to hand it off back to Abby, and she's going to talk about how to best operationalize the RAD framework.
Okay. So the next step or the next phase that we want to chat on is really how we go about operationalizing RAD. Even though the framing of RAD can seem like a new outlook or a new perspective, in actuality, a lot of the strategies that you can use to adopt RAD are quite familiar. To orient you where a particular management decision may be in the RAD space, we've been thinking about RAD choices on two axes. So the first being you have the ecological responsiveness of your system going from low to high. And this is whether or not your system will respond to intervention. So something low on this spectrum might be something like the open ocean, where you have little control over how that system is is functioning. And then something high might be something like a small pond where you have a lot of autonomy in a closed system, the relatively closed system. And then the second axis that we have is when you're looking at societal receptivity to change. So this is a spectrum from where something low on the spectrum would be when stakeholders or rights holders are very resistant to change, to something high on this end. On the other end would be those that are a little bit more open to kind of considering alternative options. And so with these two axes, you essentially form a matrix of RAD scenarios. And the first being what we're calling when social and ecological controllability are very low. This is something that we're calling COPE. And this would be something like a put and take fishery where it's not self-sustaining and cannot be maintained without any intervention, but it still provides a service through very extensive interventions. The second quadrant of this kind of RAD matrix is when social systems are really still averse to change, but the ecological systems can be very highly manipulated. And so this is when managers can really engineer that domain. And so they can employ a whole host of RAD strategies to essentially resist change. And this would be something like a very large-scale restoration effort to maintain or rehabilitate a system. The third quadrant is when societal receptivity to change is quite high, but the ecological systems themselves are not very responsive to intervention. And so in this quadrant, managers can really innovate for kind of a new management frontier where they can kind of accept that these ecological changes are happening, and then they can apply a whole host of different kind of social strategies. So something like this could be looking to foster new fishing or hunting opportunities for species that are maybe newly established to a region and more suitable for that habitat at this point. And then the last quadrant we're calling create, and this is where we see both social and ecological controllability being quite high. And so this is kind of really the sky's the limit scenario where managers can look at a whole host of diverse options, looking at any sort of strategies, but this is probably the quadrant where those direct strategies are going to be most effective. So this could take the form of many different things, including, for example, introducing genetically modified species that might be more suitable for the changing conditions. And we see kind of the utility of this sort of matrix in showing managers kind of where they are on a RAD landscape and showing what sorts of options might be feasible for actions given those kind of externalities. And it shows if you maybe want to move from one quadrant to the other, what types of levers you need to pull to make that happen. So if we could push kind of the high bounds on social or societal receptivity, maybe we could move from those cope and engineer quadrants over to the create and innovate quadrants. And maybe that might be more possible than we would have previously thought if we hadn't kind of drilled into kind of what approaches and what levers are possible in a given scenario. So just to kind of bring things back to the beginning here, when we think about our systems, we acknowledge that systems are changing in unprecedented ways. And if the past no longer reflects the future, management approaches that still look to the past for precedent will become increasingly untenable. And this can be a very daunting position, and we can be left kind of tossing our hands in the air and saying, what can we do if that's the case? And so that's where the RAD framework comes in. And again, thinking resist, accept, direct. These are kind of a trichotomy of options that can help navigate this unfamiliar territory of systems change. And framing within RAD often involves using tried and true methods that we're already using across the landscape, but it's mostly just thinking deliberately about what those available options are within a decision space, and acknowledging kind of where we are on that controllability matrix can help us prepare to adapt to ecosystem change while trying to minimize costs and consequences to the systems. So with that, I just wanted to, on behalf of Lauren, I thank you, and also on behalf of a whole host of other collaborators. This RAD framework has been a very large collaborative effort. And so while Laura and I are presenting today, we're really presenting on behalf of a whole host of our colleagues. And also just wanted to flag that we do have a RAD website at USGS that we're trying to keep current with any additional RAD related literature. And in fact, there will be an upcoming special issue in the Journal of Fisheries Management and Ecology that's specifically focused on RAD. So that will be out just next month if anyone's interested in that. So thank you.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you, Laura. We have plenty of time for questions. So if anyone has a question, feel free to ask it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask it in person.
So the journal with the upcoming special issue is the Journal of Fisheries Management and Ecology. And there was also a recent special section in bioscience on RAD as well that had five papers, Laura. I guess it was four main articles and then an introductory paper too. Go ahead, Mitch.
Thanks, Abby and Laura. That was great. I just curious. I'm coming from a perspective of sort of the structured decision making, decision analytics point of view, and I admit I haven't looked into the RAD framework in great depth. To me, it seems like it's a great way to start thinking about, as you said, the strategies and sort of open up the dialogue with decision makers and stakeholders about, what might be new ways of thinking. That's always that's often a hurdle in a decision-making context, is reliance on sort of past precedents. You touched on that, so that's fairly straightforward. The question I have though is, one thing that we often caution against that sort of comes from the psychology of decision making is that as humans we often tend to jump, there's a problem that we're facing and we tend to jump to ask, oh, what can we do about it, as sort of what we call this alternatives focused type thinking, where we kind of skip over the questions of what is it that we want to achieve, like what are our values and objectives. And so this framework does seem to focus on those strategies as equivalent to our alternatives available. In your experience with trying to apply this, do you feel that there's space where you can, before you get into the these three broad options, that you can work with the decision makers about their objectives before they start thinking about what they can do about it? Is that something where we're maybe perpetuating one of these biases, or are they more interested in jumping to those alternatives versus stopping and thinking about the objectives before that point?
I think we've definitely had lots of conversations about the objectives, and Abby and I probably did not touch on that a whole lot during this talk, and probably to some degree that some of this is covered in some of the papers we mentioned in the bioscience special issue, some of the other papers, but I think definitely it's thinking clearly about what you want out of your ecosystem. You may lose a particular ecosystem or ecosystem attribute that's really familiar, but if your goal is to maintain some type of some level of biodiversity or some type of ecosystem service or structure, even if it doesn't look like what it happened in the past, the goal kind of remains the same. It's about maintaining that structure and function. But yeah, I don't know if that's kind of getting at what you're getting at. Abby, feel free to add.
Yeah, and I guess just to add, I think I think RAD can slot into all of these different planning strategies, and it's just where you slot it in. So maybe Mitch, the RAD could come in after you've already had that kind of goal setting stage, and then once you know what that goal is, then you can kind of look at these as options for achieving it. So I don't know if that also is exactly getting at your question, but I think it's another tool in the toolbox for having kind of these adaptation planning exercises.
Yeah, that addresses it. I mean, it even though it's focused on this particular part, it sounds like, at least in the literature out there, that they're not ignoring the objective settings in their space in the process where that's kind of built in. So that's all I was concerned with. Thanks.
Abby, there's an additional question in the chat from Ilsa Kuffner. She's interested.
I can chime in and introduce myself because that's probably more the direct way of doing it. Yeah, my name is Ilsa Kuffner, and I'm actually in the natural hazards mission area. So, I kind of stumbled along on this RAD framework just through my work with the National Park Service and the partnerships that have been developed there. And, I'm finding a lot of amount of parallelism between what you guys are doing and what I'm doing with coral reefs. And a lot of my funding is now coming from the National Park Service or indirectly through some of the USGS programs that support the National Park Service science. And so it's exciting. And so I was just wondering, like, what exactly is this group? How are you open to more members? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Laura. Go ahead.
Oh, well, yeah, absolutely. We're definitely interested. I mean, the more people we can get involved in this, I think the better. And as Abby mentioned, it's a really, really large group that has participated. We're the only presenters today, but you mentioned the Park Service. There's a big group within the Park Service that are leading a lot of this work, and same with Fish and Wildlife Service. And we, in some of our papers, we've worked with the Park Service on a case study related to coral reefs and the RAD framework. So yes, absolutely. We would encourage you to, you could reach out to Abby and myself. We can give you other contacts as well. I know within the Park Service adaptation office, climate adaptation office, they're working with stakeholders to try to get this framework implemented more broadly across the country, as well as in other countries. And certainly the science aspect is something that can kind of help build confidence as far as implementing these different actions. And I mentioned workshops. I believe there is a workshop at the Wildlife Society meeting this fall in Spokane. I know more wildlifey people, maybe not as many coral people, but I'm sure there'll be other workshops related as well. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add it at this point, it's like more of a kind of informal community of practice. And there have been kind of like splinter groups talking about more specific information, like Laura had just said, that there's a wildlife focused effort with TWS, and the fisheries management and ecology piece was a result of an American Fisheries Society session that we had last year. And in that, I'll just flag that there are there's a number of marine case studies, and it's resonated even beyond kind of the climate adaptation space. So one of the articles in that special issue is actually looking at using RAD and looking at COVID responses of small scale fisheries and how their kind of responses to COVID overlay on the RAD framework. And then also looking at a question from Elliot Parsons in the chat. One of the upcoming articles that was led by Jason Dunham, also from USGS, is specifically looking at invasive species and how that could play in a RAD space as well. So yeah, so a lot of people are thinking about things, and we haven't kind of coalesced into any sort of formal group, but definitely get in touch with us if you're interested, and we can kind of engage you in ongoing efforts, and we'd be happy to help support you if you want to lead the charge on a specific coral reef focused RAD effort or something along that end too.
Oh, thank you.
just following up on Elliot's other question, thinking about island systems and continental systems. I'm a fish biologist, so thinking on the context of the opposite ends of the scale, we've had a lot of conversations on the aquatic side talking about how and kind of how we got to that and that controllability matrix, because we kept kind of butting up against like, well, you know, in the open oceans, we don't have the ability to really control how these systems are changing. So what can we do in those systems? And so that's where we kind of focused in on kind of where we have levers to act. And so I think, you know, if there are more levers on the social side, we can do things, for example, with open ocean pelagic fisheries, by actually managing the fishery as opposed to the ecosystem. Whereas in a small stream or pond, we might be able to have more ecological based approaches. So I think that applies in an island versus a continental scale system question too, if I'm reading that right. And I might be going to aquatic in that response. So maybe Laura can take a terrestrial side of that question.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a whole lot to add. I do know that our Pacific Islands cast led an RFP this last year related to the RAD framework. So I know they're thinking about, I'm not sure if they're, any of them are on this call, but I know they're thinking about RAD as far as in the Hawaiian island system, Pacific Islands, but as far as what compares to continental systems, I don't know if anyone that's working specifically on that, but certainly something, yeah, potential avenue for some engagement.
I'll thank our presenters, Abby and Laura, so much for thank you for presenting today. And again, if anyone would like to reach out and get back in contact, I'm sure they would love to talk more about this topic. All right, thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.